physician of the Nile, an ancient Egyptian sleep story. Hello and welcome to Sleep Veyra, where quiet stories, dreamlike journeys, and gentle nights are created to help you slow down, rest deeply, and drift peacefully into sleep. Tonight, we will travel far away from the restless noise of the present world, beyond the glow of modern streets, beyond the hurried sound of footsteps on stone, beyond the small bright screens that keep the mind awake long after the body has grown tired. And we will enter an older night beneath a wider sky, where the Nile moved through Egypt like a dark and shining ribbon, carrying moonlight, reeds, sleeping boats, and the quiet dreams of those who lived along its banks. In that ancient time, when the great temples still held the warmth of the sun long after evening had faded, and when the stars above the desert seemed close enough to be reflected in every bowl of water left outside a doorway, there lived a physician named Menka, a quiet man of careful hands, patient eyes, and a voice so calm that people in the city said even fever seemed to listen when he spoke. Menka did not live in the palace, although he had once been invited there, and he did not live among the wealthy houses near the Temple Road, although many important men had offered him rooms, servants, and silver in exchange for his presence, because he preferred a modest house of sun-dried brick near the river, where the evening wind could pass through linen curtains, where bundles of herbs hung from the ceiling beams, and where the Nile could be heard at night moving softly beyond the courtyard wall. His house was known by many names, because every person who came to it seemed to remember it according to what they had needed most when they arrived. Some called it the House of Herbs, because its shelves were crowded with jars of oil, honey, ground lotus root, dried mint, myrrh, crushed dates, blue water lilies, and folded linen scented with cedar. Some called it the House of Quiet Hands, because Menka never hurried when he treated a wound, never raised his voice when a child cried, and never touched a patient before allowing them first to breathe, settle, and feel that they were no longer being chased by their own fear. Others, especially those who came to him at night when sleep had abandoned them, called it the house beside the river, because Menka often led the restless not to a bed, not to a bowl of bitter medicine, and not to a priest with a chant, but to the open window facing the Nile, where he would sit beside them in the blue darkness and ask them to listen until the river began speaking in a language older than worry. On the night our story begins, the city had grown unusually still, as though the day had exhaled and forgotten to breathe in again, and a warm mist rose from the Nile, softening the outlines of boats, palms, temple columns, and sleeping roofs, until everything beyond the nearest lamps seemed to belong partly to the waking world, and partly to a dream that had not yet decided what shape it wished to take. Menka was alone in his courtyard, grinding dried leaves in a small stone bowl beneath the light of an oil lamp, while above him, the sky opened wide and dark, filled with stars arranged so clearly that he could almost imagine each one had been placed there by a patient hand before the beginning of time. He had spent the day tending to ordinary troubles, though they were never ordinary to the people who carried them, because a fisherman with a torn palm, a baker's child with a cough, an old woman whose knees ached when the river wind turned cool, a young scribe who had strained his eyes copying temple accounts by weak light, and a mother who feared her baby's fever would climb higher with the moon had each arrived carrying not only pain, but also the quiet fear that pain often brings with it. By evening, all of them had gone home with linen, herbs, instructions, and more importantly, with the feeling that someone had looked at them long enough to see not only the place where the body hurt, but also the worry gathered behind it. Menka believed that every illness had more than one doorway, and although some could be entered through the body, through blood, breath, bone, skin, heat, hunger, or poison, others open through memory, loneliness, grief, envy, shame, or the kind of tiredness that came from pretending for too long that one was stronger than one truly felt. This belief had not made him famous among all physicians, because many preferred certainty, and certainty was easier to sell than patience. But it had made him beloved among those who arrived at his door with pain they could not name and left, if not healed, then at least accompanied. That night, as the city settled beneath its roofs, and the first jackal cries rose faintly from the desert beyond the fields, Menka poured warm water over his hands, dried them on a strip of clean linen, and prepared to close the outer gate. He had almost lowered the wooden bar into place when he heard footsteps on the narrow road outside, not the quick steps of a messenger from the palace, nor the heavy steps of a man carrying injury, but the uneven, uncertain steps of someone who had walked a long distance without being sure whether he wished to arrive. Menka paused with one hand on the gate, and for a few moments there was only the sound of the river, the faint creak of a moored boat, and the small hiss of the oil lamp behind him. Then a voice, low and tired, spoke from the other side. "Physician," the stranger said, "I was told that you treat those who cannot sleep." Menka did not answer at once, because the tone of the voice told him more than the words did, and he had learned long ago that sleeplessness was rarely only the absence of sleep. He lifted the wooden bar and opened the gate. Standing in the road was a man dressed in fine linen, though it was creased from travel, with a travel cloak over one shoulder and dust along the hem of his robe. And although his face was not old, it had the drawn and hollow look of someone who had spent too many nights awake in rooms where lamps burned long after everyone else had surrendered to darkness. Behind him waited a servant holding a small chest, but the stranger raised one hand without turning and dismissed him with a softness that suggested weariness rather than authority. When they were alone, Menka stepped aside and allowed the man into the courtyard. "You may come in," he said, "though if sleep has been avoiding you for many nights, we should not frighten it by chasing after it too quickly." The stranger looked at him with surprise, perhaps because he had expected questions about symptoms, payment, family, rank, or dreams, and instead had been welcomed as one might welcome a bird that had flown too long over water. "My name is Calm," the man said after a moment, "and I serve in the record halls of the Northern Temple, where I keep accounts of grain, offerings, land, and labor, though lately the numbers continue walking across the walls even after I close my eyes." Menka nodded as though this were not strange. "Numbers are obedient in daylight," he said, leading him toward the open room beside the courtyard. "But at night, they sometimes become restless if they have been asked to carry too much of a man's life." Calm gave a faint smile, though it faded quickly, and Menka noticed that his hands trembled when he sat down on the low wooden stool near the lamp. The physician did not begin by touching him, because people who could not sleep were often already being held too tightly by invisible things, and sometimes the kindest first medicine was not a hand, a question, or an instruction, but a little distance in which the soul could discover that it was not being examined. Instead, he placed a cup of warm water with honey and crushed lotus near Calm's hand, then sat across from him with enough space between them that the man would not feel watched too closely. The room around them was simple and calm, with shelves of jars against one wall, rolled papyrus tied with linen cords, a clay basin, folded cloths, and a narrow window through which the moonlit river could be seen between the dark stems of reeds. For several minutes, neither man spoke. Menka let the silence settle first, because people who had been questioned too often usually needed silence before they could speak the truth. At last, Calm lifted the cup and drank. "I have not slept properly for 40 nights, he said, though the number came out with the automatic precision of a scribe, as if even his suffering had been entered into a ledger." "And before the 40 nights, Menka asked. "Before that, I slept enough." "Enough for whom?" Calm looked toward the window, where the river moved in the darkness, carrying a small boat past the reeds with its lamp swinging gently above the water like a low star. "I do not know," he said. Menka watched him carefully, not with suspicion, but with the tenderness of a man watching a knot begin to loosen. "That is a good beginning," he said, "because many people come to me asking for sleep, when what they have lost is not sleep itself, but permission to lay down the part of themselves that keeps watch even after the door has been closed." Calm lowered his eyes to the cup in his hands. "My wife says I speak in my sleep when I manage to sleep at all, and my son says I sit upright before dawn as if I have heard someone call my name, though there is no one there." "And have you heard someone call your name?" Menka asked. The scribe was silent for a long time, while outside, a night bird moved among the palms, and from somewhere across the river came the faint sound of a flute, so distant that it seemed less played than remembered. "No," Calm said at last, "but I think I have been waiting to be called." Menka did not ask by whom, because some questions must not be opened too quickly, especially when a man has carried the answer in darkness for so long that sudden light might frighten it back into hiding. Instead, he rose, took the oil lamp from its hook, and gestured for Calm to follow him through the courtyard to the flat roof of the house, where the night air was warmer, the stars whiter, and the Nile visible in a long curve between the sleeping city and the dark fields beyond. They sat on woven mats near the low parapet, and Menka placed the lamp between them, shielding it with one hand until the flame steadied. Below, the river moved without hurry. A line of boats rested near the bank, their sails folded like sleeping birds, while farther away the temple pylons rose in shadow against the stars, and beyond them the desert waited, immense and silent, holding the day's heat in its stones. "When I was young," Menka said, "my teacher told me that the river is the oldest physician in Egypt because it knows how to carry things without keeping them." Calm turned toward him, and for the first time since arriving, his face seemed less guarded. "Does it teach you that?" "Every night," Menka replied, "though I am still not always a good student." The scribe looked back at the Nile, and Menka let him look for a while, because there were times when a tired mind could not be persuaded into rest by advice, but could be slowly invited there by water, distance, darkness, and the soft understanding that the world was still moving even when one stopped trying to push it forward. Then, in the low and even voice he used only for the restless, the fevered, and the frightened, Menka began to tell him a story. Not a story of kings, battles, gods, or punishments, but a small story of a clay cup, a sleeping child, and a boatman who crossed the river so slowly that even the moon seemed to wait for him. The story began with a child who could not sleep during the season when the Nile was rising, because every night he imagined the water climbing the steps of his house, entering the courtyard, lifting the jars, the sandals, the sleeping mats, and the little clay cup his mother used to give him milk before bed. His fear was not foolish, Menka explained, because water was powerful and the river was older than the names people gave it. Yet fear becomes heavier when it is made to sit alone in the dark. So one night, when the child refused to close his eyes, his mother wrapped him in a linen shawl and carried him down to the riverbank, where an old boatman was preparing to cross to the western side beneath a moon so full that every ripple looked silver. The mother asked the boatman if he would carry them only a little way, not because they needed to reach the other bank, but because her child had begun to believe the river was coming for him, and she wished him to feel just once that the river could also carry him. The boatman, who had seen many fears and knew that most of them became softer when given a place to sit, helped them into the boat and pushed away from the bank without a word. The child clung to his mother at first, watching the water with wide eyes, certain that it would rise into the boat and take him. But the boatman moved the oar so gently that the surface barely broke, and the moon laid a path across the river as if it had been waiting all evening for the child to notice it. Little by little, the boy stopped holding his breath. Little by little, the houses on the bank became small and quiet. Little by little, the sound of the oar entering and leaving the water became steadier than his fear. By the time they reached the middle of the river, the child had loosened his hands from his mother's shawl and was looking not at the water beneath him, but at the stars reflected in it. The boatman, who had said nothing until then, pointed with his oar toward the reflection and told the child that the river did not steal the stars, even though it held them every night, and that some things could be carried safely without being lost. When Menka reached this part of the story, he saw Calm close his eyes, not fully and not yet in sleep, but in the way a person closes their eyes when a sentence has found an old room inside them. The physician continued softly, letting the story move as slowly as the boat, while the warm Egyptian night gathered around them and the Nile below the roof carried moonlight past the sleeping city. He told Calm that the child, after hearing the boatman's words, looked down into the dark water and saw not a monster, not a flood, and not the imagined ruin of his home, but a sky beneath the sky, wide and trembling, where the stars moved gently with every small breath of the river. And because his mother held him without tightening her arms, and because the boatman did not laugh at his fear, and because the river did nothing except carry them, the child became quiet enough to hear the soft wooden sound of the boat, the sleeping call of birds hidden among reeds, and the faraway murmur of people on the bank preparing for night. By the time they returned to shore, the child was asleep against his mother's shoulder, still holding the little clay cup in both hands, and when she carried him home, the cup was filled not with milk, but with moonlight that had gathered there by accident, or by kindness, or by one of those small mercies the world offers only when no one is asking loudly. Menka fell silent. For a long time, Calm did not speak. The lamp between them trembled once in the wind, then steadied again. Below, the Nile continued its slow passage through the dark, touching reeds, boats, mud walls, temple steps, and the sleeping edges of the city with the same patient movement, as though it had been listening to the story too, and had approved of how gently it was told. Finally, Calm opened his eyes. "I used to sleep beside the river when I was a boy," he said, and his voice was softer now, not because the night had changed it, but because some part of him had stopped defending itself. Menka waited. My father kept a small storehouse near the docks, Kam continued, and in the hot months when the rooms were too warm, we would take our mats outside and sleep beneath an awning while the boats moved past in the dark. He looked down at his hands, which had stopped trembling. I had forgotten the sound of the ropes, he said. The ropes? Menka asked. Kam nodded slowly. The ropes against the posts, when the boats moved in the current, and the little wooden groan they made, as if the boats were dreaming but did not want to drift away. Menka smiled faintly, because he knew that a man who had begun to remember sound had already stepped closer to sleep. Perhaps tonight, he said, you do not need to sleep as the temple sleeps, or as your work expects you to sleep, or as a proper man of accounts believes he should sleep, but only as the boy beside the dock slept, while the ropes creaked softly and the river carried everything past him without asking him to count it. Kam looked at the Nile again, and though his eyes were open, they had lost the hard brightness of exhaustion. What if I wake before dawn? Then you will wake before dawn, Menka said, and the river will still be here. What if the numbers return? Then let them pass like boats. What if they do not pass? Then we will sit with them until they learn the current. Kam breathed in, slowly, as if he had forgotten that breath could enter the body without being pulled by force. The night deepened around them. The temple shadows lengthened. The flute across the river disappeared. One by one, the small lamps in the nearby houses went dark, until only the stars, the moon, and Menka's oil flame remained awake above the moving water. After a while, the scribe lay down on the woven mat with his cloak folded beneath his head, and Menka sat beside him, not watching him too closely, but keeping the kind of quiet company that asks for nothing and yet makes solitude less sharp. Kam did not fall asleep all at once. Sleep rarely comes kindly when it has been hunted for many nights. First his hands loosened. Then his shoulders dropped. Then his breathing began to follow the river instead of his thoughts. And at last, sometime after the moon had passed beyond the highest palm, and the city had settled into the deepest part of night, Kam slept. Menka remained awake a little longer, not because he needed to, but because he had always loved the hour after a patient fell asleep, when the room, the roof, the courtyard, or the riverside seemed to share in the healing without claiming credit for it. He listened to Kam breathe. He listened to the Nile below. He listened to the soft creak of boats in the current, and for a moment he imagined the sleeping child from his own story, still holding the clay cup, still crossing the river beneath the moon, still learning that what carries us is not always what threatens us. When the first pale line of dawn appeared beyond the eastern roofs, Menka rose quietly, lowered the lamp flame with 2 fingers, and looked out over the river as it turned from black to blue to silver. The city would wake soon. The scribes would return to their ledgers. The bakers would stir their ovens. The fishermen would push their boats into the current. The temple doors would open, and the day, with all its measurements, duties, heat, voices, and dust, would begin again. But for now, before the first calls rose from the streets, before sandals moved over stone, before questions found their way to his gate, Menka stood in the gentle light of morning and watched the Nile carry the last of the night away. Calm woke not suddenly, and not with the startled movement of a man who had been dragged out of a troubled dream, but slowly and almost carefully, as though sleep had carried him to the edge of morning and set him down there without wanting to break the quiet that had finally gathered around him. For several moments he did not move, because he seemed to be listening inwardly to something that was no longer there. Perhaps the restless counting that had followed him for 40 nights. Perhaps the cold brightness of numbers walking across walls. Or perhaps the imagined voice that had been calling him from behind a door he had not been able to find. The roof above him was pale with dawn. The woven mat beneath his shoulder was warm from his body, and the river below continued moving with such untroubled patience that he could almost believe the night had been placed into the water and carried away while he slept. Menka was standing near the low parapet with his hands resting lightly on the sun-warmed clay, watching the eastern sky brighten beyond the city. And when he heard Calm sit up behind him, he did not turn at once, because he knew there were awakenings that needed to remain unobserved for a few breaths before they could become real. At last Calm spoke, and his voice, though still rough from sleep, had lost the dry edge it had carried the night before. "I slept," he said, as if he were reporting a miracle too delicate to be named loudly. Menka looked back at him with a small smile, the kind of smile that belonged not to pride but to gratitude, because a physician who loved his work understood that he did not create healing so much as prepare a room where healing might choose to enter. "You did," he replied, "and because you did not chase sleep, it stayed long enough to recognize you." Calm lowered his eyes, and for a moment he looked embarrassed, as if rest itself were something he had not earned properly. But then he breathed in the morning air, smelled the river, the cooling lamp oil, the dust of the roof, and the faint sweetness of bread beginning somewhere in the waking street below, and his face softened again. "I do not know what to pay you," he said, because he was a man who measured things, and because it was difficult for him to receive what could not be entered neatly into a column. Menka gathered the folded mat, shook it gently, and laid it across the parapet to air. "You may pay me by going home slowly," he said, "and by not asking the day to repay in 1 hour what the night has only just begun to restore." Calm seemed to consider this with the seriousness he might have given to a temple decree, and Menka, seeing that the old habits of account and obligation were already waiting near the edges of his face, went downstairs and returned with a small strip of papyrus, a reed pen, and ink ground with water from a blue bowl. He did not write a prescription in the usual way, nor did he list herbs, measures, timings, or warnings. Instead, he wrote a set of instructions so simple that Calm frowned when he first read them, because simplicity, to a man who had lived too long inside ledgers, often looked suspiciously like carelessness. "For 7 evenings before the lamps are lit, sit where you can hear water, even if the water is only being poured from one jar into another, and let the day pass through your mind without following any part of it too far. Before sleep, remember one sound from childhood that did not ask anything from you. If numbers appear on the wall, do not erase them and do not obey them, but imagine each one as a boat passing down river, carrying grain, lamps, letters, and the names of men who no longer need to be counted by you. If you wake before dawn, place both feet on the floor, breathe once for yourself, once for those you love, and once for the river, then lie down again without judging whether sleep returns." Calm read the lines twice, and Menka watched the small resistance in his expression, give way to something quieter, because he knew the scribe had expected medicine bitter enough to prove its strength, when what he needed first was permission gentle enough to be believed. When calm finally left, the sun had risen above the eastern roofs, turning the tops of the palm trees gold and setting small fires along the river's surface. And although the servant who had waited all night near the outer lane hurried forward to take his master's cloak, Calm lifted one hand and asked him, with surprising softness, to walk beside him rather than behind. Menka noticed this, but he said nothing, because there are small healings that become smaller when praised too quickly. He watched the two men disappear into the morning street, then closed the gate and remained with his hand against the wood for a while, feeling the warmth of the new day gather under his palm. The city was awake now. Already the air held the beginning of heat, the calling of sellers, the slap of sandals against stone, the distant bray of a donkey, the creak of carts carrying baskets of onions and clay jars, and the layered voices of people returning as people always returned, to hunger, trade, duty, gossip, prayer, complaint, and the simple astonishment of being alive for another morning. Menka washed the cups from the night before, cleaned the roof mat, trimmed the lamp wick, and opened the shelves of his workroom, because although one man had slept, there would be others who needed the steadiness of hands, the coolness of water, the comfort of being seen without being hurried. By midday, the courtyard was bright, and the linen curtains moved slowly in the river wind while 3 patients waited in the shade. A potter whose wrist had swollen after lifting a kiln door too quickly, a girl with a splinter in her heel and more fear of the needle than of the pain itself, and a young soldier who claimed he had come only for a bruise on his shoulder, though Menka could see from the way he kept glancing toward the gate that the bruise was not what had brought him there. The potter was treated with wrapped cloth, oil, and a warning not to return to work before the swelling softened, which the potter promised with the grave sincerity of a man who knew he would disobey by sunset. The girl with the splinter sat on her mother's lap, crying before Menka had even touched her foot, so he told her a very serious tale about a beetle who believed himself to be a crocodile, until one day he met an actual crocodile and decided that being small was a respectable profession. And by the time the girl was laughing through her tears, the splinter had been removed, the heel washed, and the world restored to its proper size. The soldier remained after the others had gone, sitting rigidly near the courtyard wall while the afternoon light moved over his face, and when Menka asked to see the shoulder, the young man loosened his robe with the awkward pride of someone who had learned to show wounds more easily than fear. The bruise was dark but not dangerous, spread across the upper arm in the shape of a hard blow, and Menka touched the skin lightly, feeling for heat, swelling, and the deeper injury that might lie beneath. "You will be sore for some days," he said, "but the bone is not broken." The soldier nodded, as if this should have ended the visit, yet he did not rise. Menka wrapped the shoulder with a paste of honey, crushed willow bark, and linen, then sat back on his heels and waited, because young men trained for battle often needed silence more than questions before they remembered that their voices belonged to them. At last, the soldier looked toward the doorway and spoke without meeting the physician's eyes. "Brother leaves tomorrow for the southern garrison," he said, "and I struck him yesterday during an argument about nothing, or about something so small that I cannot remember it clearly enough to hate it." Menka tied the linen knot gently. "And now the shoulder that was struck is not the one in pain," he said. The soldier swallowed, He laughed afterward because that is what he does when he does not want me to see that I have hurt him, and I became angrier because he laughed, though now I think perhaps he was only trying to make the moment smaller. The afternoon wind moved through the courtyard, carrying the smell of river mud and warm stone. Menka rose, washed his hands, and brought 2 cups of watered date wine, though he gave one to the soldier only after diluting it until it was almost more water than wine. "There are wounds that require cloth," Menka said, sitting across from him, "and there are wounds that require a man to walk before evening to the house of his brother and say the words before pride has time to make them heavy." The soldier looked down at the cup. "What words?" "The true ones if you can find them," Menka said. "And if you cannot find all of them, begin with the few that do not lie." The young man sat very still, and Menka could see him struggling with the same old enemy that visited nearly every heart in one form or another. The belief that tenderness given too late might reveal how badly it had been needed all along. At length the soldier stood, thanked him too formally, and left with his wrapped shoulder held carefully beneath his robe. And before he passed through the gate, Menka called after him, not loudly but clearly enough to reach him. "Do not wait until tomorrow to become kind." The soldier stopped, though he did not turn. Then he nodded once and continued into the street. By late afternoon, the heat had softened, and Menka sat alone in the courtyard sorting herbs into shallow bowls while shadows lengthened across the floor, and the city began its slow movement toward evening. He thought of Calm sleeping on the roof, of the little girl laughing through tears, of the soldier walking with apology caught in his throat, and he felt the familiar tenderness and weariness that came after a day spent close to the fragile places in other people's lives. There had been a time, many years earlier, when Menka had believed healing would become easier with knowledge, and in certain ways it had, because his hands were surer now, his mixtures more balanced, his eye quicker to notice danger, his voice calmer in the presence of panic. Yet in other ways it had become more mysterious, because the longer he served the sick, the more clearly he understood that the body was never merely a body, and that every pulse he touched had been shaped by years of weather no physician could fully see. As the sun lowered behind the western hills, coloring the river bronze and the temple walls with a fading red glow, Menka heard the outer gate open without a knock. He looked up. In the doorway stood a boy of perhaps 12 years, thin, dusty, and barefoot, wearing a servant's belt too large for him and holding a folded cloth to his chest with both hands. His eyes moved quickly around the courtyard, not with curiosity, but with the anxious habit of a child who had learned to measure rooms for danger before stepping fully inside them. Menka set down the herbs. "You may come in," he said. The boy did not move. "I was sent from the house of blue columns," he said, naming one of the noble houses near the temple road, "but I am not meant to be here long." "No one who is afraid of being missed is ever here long enough," Menka said gently. "But you are here now, and now is sometimes enough to begin with." The boy's mouth tightened, as though he did not understand whether the words were kindness or a trap, but after a moment he stepped into the courtyard and held out the folded cloth. Inside it was a small carved amulet in the shape of a sleeping ibis, made of pale stone, with one wing broken cleanly away. "My lady asks if this can be repaired," the boy said. Menka took the amulet carefully. though he knew before touching it that the broken wing was not the true reason the boy had come. "It can be mended," he said, turning it in his palm, "though the line will remain if one knows where to look." The boy lowered his eyes. "She said to ask whether the line is unlucky." "And what do you think?" Menka asked. The boy blinked, surprised that his opinion had entered the room. "I think a broken thing is still broken, even if a rich lady asks a careful man to hide it." Menka smiled, not because the answer amused him, but because it was honest in a way that children often are before fear teaches them to decorate truth. "That is a strong answer," he said, "and perhaps too strong to be wrong, though there are also things that become more themselves after they have been mended, because the place of breaking teaches the hand how gently it must hold them." The boy looked at the amulet, then at Menka. "My lady has not slept," he said suddenly, the words coming out as if they had escaped before he could stop them. Menka did not move. "She sits by the blue columns and keeps the broken wing in her hand, and when the other women tell her to rest, she says the house is too quiet, though it is not quiet at all, because there are servants and musicians and birds in cages and men coming through the front rooms all day." "Has someone died?" Menka asked softly. The boy nodded. "Her little daughter, before the flood season." The courtyard seemed to grow still around them. Even the river wind appeared to pause at the linen curtains. Menka closed his hand gently around the amulet, feeling the broken edge beneath his thumb. "And did she send you only to ask about the wing?" The boy hesitated, then shook his head. "She said if you knew what the wing meant, you would come after moonrise." Menka looked toward the west, where the last light of day was sinking behind the roofs. And he understood that the night ahead would not be like the last one, because sleeplessness carried by grief had a different weight from sleeplessness carried by duty. Duty could sometimes be loosened by permission. Grief had to be entered like a temple after sunset, slowly, respectfully, and without pretending that a lamp could replace the sun. He wrapped the amulet again in its cloth and handed it back to the boy. "Tell your lady that I will come," he said, "and tell her that the wing is not unlucky." The boy received the cloth with both hands. "What is it then?" Menka looked toward the river, where the first evening lamps were beginning to appear on the boats. "It is waiting," he said. The boy did not ask what that meant, perhaps because he had already carried too many messages to add another, or perhaps because some part of him understood that the answer was meant for someone else. After he left, Menka sat for a while in the dimming courtyard, listening to the city change its voice as day became evening. The cellars grew quieter. The temple bells began. Women called children in from the street. The first bats moved above the walls. A boatman laughed somewhere along the riverbank, and the sound rose into the warm air before fatting among the palms. Menka gathered what he would need: a small lamp, linen, oil of blue lotus, a little honey, powdered myrrh, a cord for measuring breath, and a narrow roll of papyrus on which no words had yet been written. He did not know whether he would use any of these things. Often he brought medicines not because he expected them to heal, but because hands, when they could not carry certainty, needed to carry something. Before leaving, he stood in the open room facing the river and placed one palm against the cool wall. He had treated grief many times, if grief could be treated at all, but each time it arrived wearing a different face, and each time he had to remind himself that the physician's task was not to persuade sorrow to leave before it had been heard. When the moon rose, pale and round above the eastern roofs, Menka closed his gate and walked toward the house of blue columns. The road near the river was quieter now, lit by oil lamps placed in niches along the walls, and as he passed sleeping houses, closed courtyards and small shrines where incense still curled in the warm air, he heard the soft life of the city settling behind doors. A mother humming, a jar being set down, a man coughing in his sleep, a child murmuring from a dream, a dog turning twice before lying on dust cooled by night. The noble quarter stood higher above the river, where the houses were larger, the walls smoother, and the gardens hidden behind painted gates. The house of blue columns was easy to find, because two tall pillars flanked its entrance, painted the deep blue of evening sky and decorated with golden lotus flowers that caught the lamplight beautifully, even though the house beyond them felt strangely still. The boy who had visited Menka opened the gate before he knocked, as if he had been waiting with his ear close to the wood. "She is in the inner court," he whispered. Menka followed him through rooms cooled by stone floors and perfumed with expensive oils, past painted walls, carved chairs, hanging linen and shallow pools where lotus flowers floated in water so still that they seemed painted there. No music played, despite the boy's mention of musicians. No women spoke. No birds sang in the cages hanging beneath the eaves. The house was not quiet because it lacked sound. It was quiet because grief had entered it, and every living thing inside had lowered its voice. In the inner court, beneath the open sky, a woman sat beside a square pool, holding the broken ibis amulet in both hands. She wore white linen without jewelry, and her hair, though carefully braided, had loosened at the temples, as if she had forgotten, halfway through the evening, why appearances were supposed to matter. Menka stopped at the edge of the court and bowed, not as one bows to rank, but as one bows before a room where love has suffered. The woman looked up. "You came," she said. "Yes," Menka replied, "though I do not yet know whether you sent for a physician, a repairer of stone, or simply a witness." She lowered her gaze to the amulet. "I do not know either." That answer, more than any display of tears, told Menka how deep the wound was. He sat across from her, close enough to be present and far enough not to invade the small circle of sorrow she had drawn around herself. For a while, they listened to the water in the pool. A few stars reflected there, trembling whenever a night insect touched the surface. "My daughter carried this bird everywhere," the woman said at last, and because she spoke without looking at him, Menka understood that the story was not being offered to him yet, but to the air, the pool, the night, and perhaps to the child who was no longer there to receive it. "My daughter carried this bird everywhere," the woman said at last, and because she spoke without looking at him, Menka understood that the story was not being offered to him yet, but to the air, the pool, the night, and perhaps to the child who was no longer there to receive it. She believed it watched over her while she slept, though I do not remember who first told her such a thing, because children sometimes create their own protections and then convince the adults around them that these protections have always existed. The woman turned the little stone ibis in her hands, touching the broken place where the wing had once been, and the moonlight along the edge of the fracture made it appear not wounded, but unfinished, as if the small bird had been carved in the middle of becoming something else. She was called Merit, the woman continued, and she had the habit of asking questions after everyone had grown tired of answering them. Questions about the river, the stars, the painted eyes on boats, the voices of birds before dawn, and whether the dead became lighter after leaving the body, because she said people looked too heavy when they were alive, and she hoped they were allowed to rest afterward. Menka listened without interrupting, because grief, when it finally begins to speak, must not be guided too firmly or it may mistake guidance for dismissal. And he had learned from many houses, many bedsides and many quiet courtyards that the first medicine for sorrow is not advice, but room. She was ill for 9 days, the woman said, and although her voice remained steady, the hand holding the amulet tightened until the knuckles paled. The fever came in the evening and seemed ordinary at first, because children are often warm and then cool again by morning. But each day she seemed to move farther away from the room, even when her eyes were open, and by the 7th night she spoke to people I could not see. The pool beside them reflected the moon in a trembling square of light, and a single lotus leaf moved slowly against the stone edge, though there was no wind inside the court. I sent for physicians, she said. I sent for priests. I sent for women who knew songs older than temples, and men who carried little boxes filled with powders from the desert, and everyone came with hands full of certainty, until they understood that certainty had no chair in the room where my child was lying. Menka bowed his head slightly, not to agree and not to disagree, but to acknowledge the weight of a truth spoken after too many useless reassurances. She died before dawn, the woman said, and because I had not slept for 3 nights, I thought at first that she had only become very quiet. So I waited for her to breathe again while the lamp beside her bed burned lower and lower. And when my sister began to cry, I became angry with her for disturbing what I believed was still sleep. Her voice thinned but did not break. Menka remained still. The boy who had guided him into the house stood near the entrance of the court, half hidden behind one of the blue columns, and although he tried to make himself invisible, Menka could see that he was listening with the painful seriousness of a child who had grown close to sorrow without being invited to understand it. Since then, the woman said, I have not been able to sleep in any room where she once slept, nor in any room where she did not sleep, because the rooms that knew her remember too much, and the rooms that did not know her feel cruel because they continue existing as if nothing has been taken from the world. Menka looked toward the pool, where the moon had been divided by a ripple, and then slowly gathered itself back into one pale shape. What is your name? He asked softly. The woman seemed surprised by the question, perhaps because everyone in the house had called her mistress, lady, mother, or widow of joy for so long that her own name had moved to the far side of grief. Seisha, she said after a moment. Menka repeated it once, gently, not as a formality, but as if returning something to her. Seisha, he said, I cannot make the room forget your daughter, and I would not do so even if such a thing were within the power of any physician, because a house that forgets a child has not healed, but only become empty in a quieter way. Seisha looked at him then, and in her eyes there was suspicion, pain, and the faintest trace of relief, because he had not promised the impossible. I was told you help people sleep, she said. I sometimes help people stop fighting the night long enough for sleep to come near, Menka replied. But grief is not sleeplessness in the usual sense, because grief keeps watch not from fear alone, but from love that does not know where to place itself after the body it loved is gone. Seisha lowered her gaze to the ibis again. I am afraid that if I sleep, I will leave her alone. Menka let the words remain between them for a while. Above the court, the stars held their places. Somewhere beyond the walls, a servant closed a door with great care. From the cages beneath the far eaves, a sleeping bird shifted once and settled again. At the river, Menka said at last, there are boats tied to posts all night, and although the ropes loosen and tighten with the current, and although the boats move slightly as if dreaming of departure, they remain held because someone has made a knot that allows movement without abandonment. Seisha listened, though her eyes stayed on the amulet. Perhaps tonight, he continued, we do not ask you to let go of merit, and perhaps we do not ask you to sleep as though nothing has happened, because that would be a cruel request and an untrue one. But we might ask whether love can make a different kind of knot, one that does not require you to stand awake forever beside an empty bed in order to prove that she mattered. The woman's shoulders, which had been held high and motionless, lowered by the smallest degree. What kind of knot? She asked. Menka opened his medicine bag and removed the narrow blank roll of papyrus he had brought, along with the small jar of blue lotus oil, the powdered myrrh, and a reed pen wrapped in linen. I do not know yet, he said, because a good knot must be made from what is true, and I have only just arrived. He unrolled the papyrus on the stone beside the pool and smoothed it with his hand. Tell me one thing Merit loved that was not given to her by adults. Seisha blinked, and for a moment she seemed almost offended by the simplicity of the question, as if her sorrow had expected something heavier. Then she looked toward the far side of the court, where the moonlight touched a painted wall of papyrus reeds and birds. She loved the sound of sandals being washed, Seisha said slowly. I do not know why, but when the servants washed the dust from sandals in the evening, she would sit nearby and listen to the water being poured, and she said it sounded like little rivers going home. Menka wrote this down. Not quickly, not as a record, but as though the sentence itself deserved to be placed carefully into the world. Tell me one thing she believed that no one taught her. Seisha breathed in, and the breath trembled at first, but then deepened. She believed the moon followed her from room to room because it was lonely. Menka wrote that down too. Tell me one thing she did when she was sleepy but refusing sleep. For the first time, the shape of a memory moved across Seisha's mouth. Not quite a smile, but something that had once known how to become one. She would hold this ibis against her cheek and whisper into its broken little beak, even before the wing broke, because she said birds understood secrets better if you spoke to them from the side. Menka wrote. The boy behind the column shifted, and Seisha looked toward him. For a moment, the old habits of rank seemed to return to her face, as if she had suddenly remembered that grief had been overheard by someone who served in the house. But then the expression softened and changed into something more human, more tired, and more aware of how many people had been carrying silence around her. She liked you, Pazer, Seisha said to the boy, and her voice did not command him closer but allowed him to exist. The boy stepped out from behind the column slowly, clutching his hands together. She said I walked too quietly, he said, almost in a whisper, and that if I was not careful, I would become a shadow before I became a man. Seisha closed her eyes, and when she opened them, they were wet. That sounds like her. Menka looked at the boy. Tell me one thing you remember. Pazer glanced at Seisha, then at Menka, uncertain whether permission given once was strong enough to hold him. She liked the blue fish in the pool, he said, nodding toward the dark water. But there is only one blue fish, and she said it was rude that everyone called it the blue fish instead of asking its name. What did she name it? Menka asked. Pazer looked embarrassed. Old Uncle Morning. The answer entered the court so unexpectedly that even Seisha made a sound, half sob and half laugh, and the sound startled one of the birds in the cages, which fluttered once before returning to sleep. Menka wrote the name carefully onto the papyrus. Old Uncle Morning. Then he set down the pen and looked at the words they had gathered. Sandals being washed like little rivers going home. The moon lonely enough to follow a child. Secrets whispered sideways into the beak of a stone bird. A servant boy in danger of becoming a shadow. And a blue fish named Old Uncle Morning. These are not medicines in the way people usually mean medicine, Menka said. But they are places where merit is still alive in the world, not in the body, and not as a voice that can answer when called, but as a pattern left in those who loved her and were changed by being near her. Seisha pressed the ibis amulet to her chest. I do not know what to do with them. No, Menka said, and that is why we will not ask you to do anything large tonight. He mixed a small amount of blue lotus oil with honey and powdered myrrh in a shallow dish, then dipped one finger into the mixture and touched it lightly to the broken place on the amulet's wing. This will not repair the stone, he said, but it will prepare it to receive repair later, when your hands are steadier or when another hand can help without feeling like an intruder. Seisha watched him. Why not mend it now? Because tonight the broken wing has brought us the truth, and it would be unwise to cover the doorway before we have thanked it for opening. For the first time since he had entered the house of blue columns, the air in the inner court seemed to move more freely. Menka wrapped the amulet again, but not completely. He left the broken wing visible, glistening faintly with oil in the moonlight. Then he asked Pazer to bring a small bowl of clean water, and when the boy returned, Menka placed the bowl beside the pool, where it caught the reflection of the moon in a smaller, steadier circle. Seisha, he said, tonight I would like you to wash your hands as you would wash the hands of someone who has been holding something heavy for a long time. She hesitated, but then placed the amulet on the cloth and dipped her fingers into the bowl. Her hands trembled. Menka did not reach to steady them. Slowly, she poured water over one hand with the other, and then over the other hand in turn. And as she did, Menka spoke in the same low voice with which he had told Kam the story of the child and the river. There are hands that have held fever, hands that have held small cups, hands that have smoothed hair from a damp forehead, hands that have opened doors for physicians, hands that have pressed cloths to the skin and lifted lamps near beds. And when such hands are empty afterward, they do not become useless, though they may feel unbearable for a time. Seisha's breath caught, but she continued washing. There are hands that do not know where to go after loss, Menka continued. And for a while they return again and again to the last object, the last garment, the last toy, the last place where warmth remained. because hands are slower than the mind and often need many nights to understand what the mind has already been forced to know. The water in the bowl clouded slightly with dust and oil from her skin. Pazer stood very still. The moon remained in the pool. "When your hands are clean," Menka said, "not clean from memory and not clean from love, but clean from the long labor of gripping sorrow without rest, you may place them open on your knees, and for one breath you may allow them to hold nothing." Seisha did as he asked. The movement was small, but in the court it felt immense. Her open hands rested on the white linen of her lap, pale in the moonlight, empty and trembling. Menka waited until the trembling lessened. Then he lifted the papyrus and placed it beside her, where she could see the words. "We will leave this here tonight," he said, "not as a spell and not as a cure, but as a lamp made of memories, so that if sleep comes near and you fear you are leaving Merit alone, you may remember that she is not only in the room you are afraid to leave, but also in little rivers going home, in the lonely moon, in secrets spoken sideways, in Pazer remembering not to become a shadow, and in old Uncle mourning, who has perhaps been waiting a long time to be called by his proper name." Seisha looked at the pool, and for the first time she seemed truly to see it. Near the far edge, beneath the reflected stars, a small fish moved through the water with a faint blue shimmer. It turned once slowly as fish do, unaware of grief names physicians, mother, or the strange responsibilities placed upon them by children. Seisha laughed then, very quietly, and the laugh broke into tears before it finished. Menka lowered his eyes, giving her privacy inside the sound. Pazer began to cry too, but silently, wiping his face with the back of his wrist, as if ashamed of being discovered by his own heart. The night deepened. The house remained still around them, yet the stillness was different now. No longer the frozen quiet of rooms afraid to disturb sorrow, but the living quiet of a place listening while sorrow finally found a voice. After some time, Seisha asked, "Will I dream of her?" Menka looked at the moonlit water before answering. "Perhaps," he said, "or perhaps you will dream of the river, or of sandals being washed, or of nothing that can be remembered in the morning, and none of these will mean that love has failed. I'm afraid of waking and losing her again." "You may wake and feel the loss again," Menka said, "because mourning is honest in that way, yet you may also wake with one small breath more than you had tonight, and sometimes grief does not become smaller, but the life around it becomes large enough to hold it more gently." Seisha nodded, though he could see she did not fully believe him yet. Belief, like sleep, could not be ordered. It could only be invited. Menka asked that a sleeping mat be placed not in Merit's room, nor in Seisha's own chamber, but here beside the pool, under the open sky, where the moon, the blue columns, the water, the papyrus of memories, and the little broken ibis could all remain with her without closing the walls too tightly around her heart. The servants, moving with careful quiet, brought linen, a low cushion, and a light coverlet, and as they arranged them, Seisha did not resist, perhaps because the decision had been made softly enough that it did not feel like surrender. Before she lay down, she took the broken ibis and placed it beside the papyrus. Then, after a moment, she looked at Pazer. "Will you bring a small bowl of water tomorrow evening?" she asked, "and wash the sandals near the pool as she liked." The boy nodded quickly, unable to speak. "And perhaps," Seisha added, with a fragile steadiness that made Menka's chest ache. "You may tell me whether old Uncle Morning is well." Pazer nodded again. Seisha lay down beside the pool. Her eyes remained open for a long time, and Menka sat near the blue column without watching her too closely, just as he had sat beside Calm, keeping company with the threshold between waking and sleep. The moon moved slowly over the court. The fish turned beneath the water. A night insect touched the pool, sending small circles across the reflected stars. Somewhere beyond the walls, the river carried boats, lamps, reeds, and the final warmth of the day toward the north. At last, Seisha's hands, which had been folded too tightly over her heart, loosened and slipped to her sides. Her breathing did not become peaceful all at once, because grief sleeps lightly at first, but it became deeper than before, and after many minutes the lines around her mouth softened, not into happiness, but into the first mercy of rest. Pazer sat on the floor near the entrance with his knees drawn up, and before long his head leaned against the blue column and he too fell asleep, his face still marked by tears and moonlight. Menka remained awake until he was certain that neither would startle immediately back into sorrow. Then he rose quietly, took one step toward the papyrus, and added a final line beneath the memories they had written together. A broken wing does not mean the bird has forgotten the sky. He set the reed pen down. When he left the house of blue columns, the moon had passed behind the roof, and the road outside was cool and pale beneath the stars. The city slept around him. The noble houses, the narrow alleys, the temple walls, the river steps, the market stalls covered for night, and the small shrines with their fatting incense all seemed held in the same deep pause between one sorrow and the next morning's strength. Menka walked slowly back toward the river, carrying his lamp unlit in one hand, because the moon was enough. He was tired now, but it was a clean tiredness, the kind that came not from being emptied by the pain of others, but from having stood carefully beside it without turning away. When he reached his own gate, he found a small object resting on the threshold. At first he thought it was a stone dropped by a child, but when he bent down, he saw that it was a little clay cup, old, chipped at the rim, and filled not with milk, not with water, but with pale moonlight. Menka picked it up gently. There was no one in the street, only the river moving beyond the wall, dark and patient, carrying everything it was given without keeping it forever. He stood there for a long moment, holding the cup, and though he did not know whether it had been left by a grateful servant, a child playing in the evening, or one of those small mysteries that gather around houses where many people have finally been allowed to sleep, he smiled and carried it inside. Before dawn, Menka placed the cup on the shelf beside his jars of honey, lotus, cedar, and myrrh. He did not label it. Some medicines, he thought, did not need names because their work was not to cure the body, but to remind the hands, the eyes, and the heart that even after sorrow, the world still knew how to hold light.